Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week, it's your turn to take a step up onto the soapbox and tell us what's been on your mind.
Yep.
And this topic will be no surprise at all for our regular listeners, because this is a passion which shows up in many of the questions you've asked in the past and the ways that you approach all of the topics that we bring to the table here on Mansplaining.
Yes, very true.
Because this week you're going to be talking about Democratic Party politics and the future of the party and the future of the country, considering that from my perspective and your perspective and probably many other people's perspectives, a strong, vital election-winning Democratic Party might be the only thing that stands between us and a real live fascist government here in the United States.
Yes.
I understand that you are going to be telling us about Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania and why you believe he's the future of the Democratic Party. So please take it away.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Like you said, in this episode, I'm going to focus on one politician's career to make an argument about the future I'd like to see for the Democratic Party and for our country. It's a future in which some white working class voters come back to a coalition they abandoned in recent decades. At least I hope so. And I want to start by saying this subject is personal for me. I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, a densely packed working class city in the shadow of the Big Apple. When I lived there in the 1960s and 1970s, Bayonne was populated largely by Irish, Italian, and Polish American Catholics working blue-collar jobs in places like the oil refineries that Bayonne was noted for. My father was a high school dropout who worked as a machinist. My mother was a housewife who went back to work as a telephone switchboard operator when I was 7. My parents and most of the grown-ups we knew voted Democratic, a vestige of the New Deal coalition whose policies led to the greatest flourishing of working people's lives in American history. They were blue-collar liberals who prioritized pocketbook issues like jobs and wages, voted for JFK and LBJ and Jimmy Carter, and hated Nixon and the Republicans. By the time I was a senior in high school, the New Deal coalition was fraying, the Reagan Revolution had begun, and lots of people in Bayonne became Reagan Democrats, my father being one of them. This was part of a gigantic and ongoing resorting of the American electorate in which traditional Democratic constituencies like working-class whites and people without college degrees became Republicans, while traditional Republican constituencies like college-educated people working white-collar jobs became Democrats. Today, I profile as one of those white-collar Democrats, but I remember where I came from. I still feel aligned with the values of blue-collar liberalism, and I have trouble reconciling this resorting of voters with the Democratic Party's history of standing up for working people. Though it seems obvious to me that modern-day Democratic policies are plainly better for the working class than the cruelty and grievance offered by modern-day Republicans, blue-collar liberals have become an endangered species in our politics. Many books have been written about the phenomenon of working-class people voting against their interests, and I'm not going to revisit those arguments today. Instead, I want to talk about how Democrats can reconnect with working-class voters and whose blue-collar liberalism might point the way to that future. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 national elections and have a clear, though slight, majority. But as we've discussed in prior episodes of Mansplaining, the minoritarian tendencies of American government manifested by things like partisan gerrymandering, the Senate filibuster, and the Electoral College, rig the game such that Democrats need to win disproportionately large victories simply to hold power. The question becomes, how do you win big? How do you turn 51% into, say, 55%? I think it's with a blue-collar liberal message that emphasizes pocketbook issues like those that attracted my parents and their parents all those years ago, while decentering some of the more controversial lightning rod social issues that, more often than not, create fissures among Democratic-leaning voters. Now, just to be clear, I'm not making a prediction today about who will be the Democratic nominee for president in 2028. I'm focusing instead on whose views are most consonant with the idea of building an enduring center-left governing coalition. The guy I have in mind probably won't become president. For one thing, he'd have to wear a suit to work every day, and I doubt he's on board with that.
Our first hoodie president.
Yes, right. But I sure hope we pay attention to what he's saying, because his biography, his record in office, and even his appearance make him one of the most compelling voices in American politics. Most Americans don't know much about John Fetterman if they've even heard his name. You mentioned something last time, Mark, that you knew very little about him. Can you repeat that? Like, what did you know about John Fetterman prior to me announcing him as the topic of this episode?
I knew that he ran against Dr. Oz in his election.
Yes.
I knew that he used social media very effectively to mock Dr. Oz's fairly erratic campaign for that office, and that he gained respect within the media circles that I follow in terms of just being very nimble and self-aware and funny in response to that campaign, whereas we could easily imagine another politician being very stiff and upright and just failing to connect with people.
Yes, all true. And I would say you know probably a good bit more than most people do about Fetterman. And that's a little surprising because he's attracted a fair share of media attention. For example, The Atlantic magazine named him one of its 27 brave thinkers back in 2009. I want to dwell on his biography because it explains better than I could why he's a potentially transformative figure. John Fetterman is a 54-year-old married father of three who currently serves as Pennsylvania's junior senator after winning an open seat in 2022. Fetterman was the only Democrat to flip a U.S. Senate seat in the 2022 cycle. Prior to joining the Senate, from 2006 to 2018, he served as the four-term mayor of Braddock, a steel town 10 miles upriver from Pittsburgh, and then as lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania from 2019 to 2022, stepping down from that position after his election to the Senate. Fetterman was born to teenage parents in the small town of West Reading and raised in a suburb of York, the 10th most populous city in Pennsylvania. In interviews, he's characteristically candid about the circumstances of his life, telling a writer for The Atlantic, quote, "I was an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy to two 19-year-olds that were casually dating, and my father was a union grocery worker at the ShopRite, and that's what allowed my family to survive while he went to college," end quote. His parents did not come from money, but they were conservative Republicans who became affluent when his father started an insurance firm. And Fetterman came of age fully expecting to follow in his dad's footsteps. After attending his father's alma mater, Albright College in Reading, and graduating with a degree in finance, he got an MBA at the University of Connecticut and worked in Pittsburgh for a couple of years for the major insurer Chubb. He's very open about his relative privilege and what he calls the random lottery of birth, telling a local interviewer in 2015 that, quote, "Through no hard work of my own, no due diligence or anything like that, I was born into a family that afforded me food, shelter, love, stability, acceptance, college, and graduate school. These are things every family should have in theory, but so many families don't." End quote.
Yeah.
When Fetterman was in business school at UConn in the spring of 1993, one of his best friends died in a car accident, which set in motion events that prefigured the rest of his career. To help deal with his grief, he volunteered as a big brother and was matched with an 8-year-old boy whose father had died of AIDS and whose mother was wasting away from the same disease. Ignorant about HIV, Fetterman remembered being afraid to shake her hand when they first met. Deeply affected by the situation, he promised the boy's mother that he would look out for her son after she was gone, and he did that. It was nothing short of a moral awakening for Fetterman, who later reported that he had sleepwalked as a young adult and that he, quote, "made the choice that I didn't want to spend the rest of my professional career just making my own circumstances even better than they were." End quote. In 1995, he joined AmeriCorps, the service organization newly established by the Clinton administration, and was sent to Pittsburgh's Hill District, which had been suffering from a mass displacement of jobs for decades, where he helped set up computer labs for low-income students. He eventually earned a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School, where he failed one assignment by stubbornly refusing to offer a solution for how to cut Social Security. He first came to Braddock in the early 2000s to manage a program helping at-risk youth who were out of school to earn their GEDs. In 2005, at the age of 35, after 2 of his GED students were shot on the streets of Braddock, his students encouraged him to run for mayor, and so he did, winning the Democratic primary by a single vote. Braddock was founded in 1755 and played an outsized role in American history. It's where the French and Indian War started. It's where George Washington got his first combat experience. And it's where Andrew Carnegie placed his first steel mill in 1873. Thanks to an infusion of immigrants working in the mills, its population grew to over 20,000 in the early decades of the 20th century, but then contracted by 90% as, in Fetterman's telling, it was, quote, torn apart by large macro forces like deindustrialization, globalization, free trade, and suburbanization, end quote. Its steel mills experienced mass layoffs and closures in the 1980s. Like so many other American towns, it suffered through the crack epidemic. It was on the state's list of severely distressed municipalities for 35 years between 1988 and 2023. When Fetterman was mayor, median family income was only $22,212, while the percentage of residents living at or below the poverty line hovered just under 40%. As mayor, Fetterman quickly realized there were no quick-fix solutions for what he called forgotten legacy cities, like Braddock, that had been neglected for decades. He used his family's money to start a nonprofit that invested in the town by buying a church that was slated for demolition and converting it into a community center. His administration started the first art gallery in the local region, with public art installations and free studio space for artists, lured small businesses with loft spaces at cheap rents, implemented a community policing model that reduced the violence that had plagued the town, opened an urgent care center after the local hospital closed, repurposed abandoned lots into urban farms staffed by teenagers growing organic vegetables and fruit trees, built an outdoor pizza oven with bricks from a demolished building, built the town's first public basketball court, and attracted investment from large companies like Levi's, which shot a commercial in Braddock and donated money used to finance a new playground and hire a children's librarian. Buoyed by those improvements, the people of Braddock re-elected Fetterman 3 times by wide margins. Fetterman used Braddock as a laboratory for implementing some progressive populist ideas about urban renewal and how to re-engage with residents. His approach was simultaneously forward-thinking and a throwback to older ideas about the efficacy of politics. Ben Wickler, the chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, described the throwback aspect this way to Ezra Klein of the New York Times. Quote, "The experience of being in a really competitive state suggests that what the Democratic Party is at its core is very different than what you see on Twitter. Fundamentally, Democrats are the people who are in politics to make government work for people, which is a very old New Deal conception." End quote. Here's another old conception that Fetterman did his part to renew: comity and cooperation among political rivals. During his campaign for lieutenant governor, Fetterman developed an unlikely friendship with Jeff Bartos, his Republican opponent. Their televised debate was notable for its high-minded focus on issues and the obvious respect the two men had for each other. As a writer for the Philadelphia Citizen put it, quote, "Their close relationship was a testament to the quaint idea that in politics you can disagree without being disagreeable, and that when you know a rival, really know them, it enhances the likelihood of finding common ground." End quote. Fetterman said, quote, "The idea of binary politics is just silly. If you're for X, you're evil, and if you're for Y, you're pure. It's the dearth of nuance." End quote. Asked what citizens can do to encourage politicians to model civility, he added, quote, "Stop rewarding fringe behavior and fringe ideas. Demonizing gets rewarded. Voters have to reward problem solving." End quote. As lieutenant governor, Fetterman and his wife Giselle declined to live in State House, the mansion in Harrisburg reserved for his office, and instead opened the pool there to local kids. He also worked to advance his prison reform agenda, advocating for rehabilitation over retribution, supporting clemency for model prisoners, increasing commutations and pardons, and expunging criminal convictions for many nonviolent drug offenses involving marijuana, and strongly advocating to abolish the death penalty. To win the Democratic nomination for Senate, Fetterman easily defeated a formidable moderate, Representative Connor Lamb, and his success was a revelatory surprise to local Democrats. As David A. Graham wrote in The Atlantic, Lamb seemed, quote, "like a candidate created in a Democratic senatorial campaign committee lab. Young, Kennedy handsome, a Marine and former federal prosecutor who looked born to wear suits." By contrast, Fetterman looked like he was hacked together from spare parts in an oil-streaked Pittsburgh chopper garage, end quote. Indeed, Fetterman's look is both a vital part of his appeal and a window into his priorities. He stands 6 feet 8 inches tall, with a shaved head and salt and pepper goatee, and yet, despite standing a head taller, he looks like many of his voters. Most days, as you pointed out, Mark, he wears a hoodie and baggy shorts to work. He's partial to clothing made by Carhartt, a brand associated with coal miners, construction workers, and more recently, hip-hop artists. Even more striking than what he wears is what he won't do when it comes to sartorial choices. He doesn't perform patriotism, so no American flag pin on his lapel. And on most days, no lapel at all. He refuses to wear business suits unless absolutely necessary. For a long time, he owned only one suit, which he wore as lieutenant governor to preside over the Pennsylvania Senate. He bought a new suit for his swearing in as a U.S. Senator. In September 2023, the Senate relaxed its dress code to allow for Fetterman's casual dress, but then quickly reversed itself when his fellow senators complained about the loss of decorum. Asked about his wardrobe, Fetterman has said, quote, I just dress to be comfortable, end quote. What a concept, eh?
Yeah, speaking as a man who is wearing a hoodie at this very moment and who also owns only one suit that I wear to weddings and pretty much nowhere else.
Yes.
He sounds like a man I can relate to.
Yes, me too. And I agree with what you just said about dress. I also feel like I dress for comfort 99% of the time. And I've never understood why everybody doesn't dress for comfort and why we have such rules of decorum on dress in places like the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
On his left forearm, Fetterman has a tattoo of Braddock's zip code, 15104. On his right forearm are tattooed the dates that 9 Braddock residents were lost to violence in his time as mayor. He has a devoted following on social media where he blasts out witty memes about his political opponents. His 2 dogs, Levi and Artie, have their own account on X with more than 25,000 followers. In explaining why people were drawn to him as a politician, he used a simile that was oddly apt. Quote, "People are tired of prepackaged things. They want to go to a real restaurant, not TGI Fridays. Most political candidates are like TGI Fridays, franchises of what the party wants them to be. But we're coming out with an authentic product," end quote. His authenticity includes ample cursing, even in his public statements. And I must say I love him for that, too. His appeal cuts across the polarized landscape of contemporary politics. On the campaign trail, he heard from lots of Pennsylvania Republicans who respect him and even switched their party registration to vote for him. In polling done during the 2022 Senate race, some Trump supporters said they'd consider voting for Fetterman. A big part of Fetterman's appeal is his mischievous sense of humor, which played a large part in his defeat of the millionaire TV huckster Dr. Mehmet Oz in the 2022 Senate race. The best example is when Oz released a campaign commercial in which he shopped for raw vegetables at a local supermarket and blamed Joe Biden and the Democrats for the high prices. Besides all the factual inaccuracies about the prices of the items he gathered, Oz also botched the name of the supermarket he was in, calling it Wegner's instead of Redner's. Worst of all, he explained his purpose as assembling the ingredients for crudité, a fancy French word for raw vegetables and dip that almost no regular Pennsylvanian uses. The ad easily made the short list of the worst ads in political campaign history. Fetterman's campaign jumped on Oz's gaffe, cutting its own short video of Fetterman holding the contents of a veggie tray and telling voters that if it looks like anything other than a veggie tray to them, then, quote, "I am not your candidate," end quote. I'll post both videos to our Facebook page because they underscore the effectiveness of Fetterman's street cred as a regular Pennsylvanian compared to Oz's obvious phoniness. But that's far from the only example of Fetterman's irreverent sense of humor. During the Senate campaign, he enlisted famous New Jerseyites like Snooki from Jersey Shore and the musician Stephen Van Zandt to make videos poking fun at the carpetbagging Dr. Oz. And he also started an online petition to get Oz inducted into the New Jersey Hall of Fame. After the serial fabulist George Santos was expelled from Congress and started a new and lucrative grift making cameo videos for hire, Fetterman trolled Santos by paying him to cut a Christmas video urging Bobby to stand his ground and not, quote, "get bogged down by all the haters out there," end quote. Bobby turned out to be the embattled Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who had recently been indicted for corruption. Fetterman was the first Democrat to call for Menendez to resign, stating that his unethical behavior tarnishes the party's message. Right before the Senate primary election in May 2022, Fetterman suffered a stroke that was serious enough that doctors implanted a pacemaker and defibrillator. He's also had mental health issues. He left the Senate for about 2 months in early 2023 and voluntarily admitted himself to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, then publicly discussed his diagnosis of severe clinical depression, which he had struggled with his entire life. His honesty came across as refreshing, and it humanized him with the many voters who suffered from or had friends or loved ones who suffered from similar ailments. What I think all this backstory makes plain is that John Fetterman is relatable in a way that few other high-profile Democrats are. He's got a regular guy aesthetic that makes him popular both to voters and reporters. It's not like Democrats don't understand the stakes of the resorting I mentioned at the top of this episode. Despite the steady increase in college attendance, there are still many more non-college voters than college-educated voters in the USA, so Democrats need to remain viable among the working class. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut articulated the challenge this way, quote, "It's hard to say you're the party of lower-income working families when they are rapidly leaving the ranks of your movement. Low-income voters get to decide for themselves who their chosen party is. If we don't start listening to them about what they really want, we will no longer be the party of the working class, no matter how we label ourselves." End quote. What follows is a curated list of Fetterman's policy views. You tell me whether he's listening to working class voters about what they really want. His priorities have been summarized alliteratively as workers, wages, weed. I think they form a solid blue-collar liberal agenda for America. He favors cutting taxes for working people. He supports a wealth tax, using as a benchmark those Americans who own yachts. He's skeptical about free trade deals like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Here's a quote from his website: "End immoral price gouging." This might seem mysterious to you and me, but to working people struggling to make rent and feed their kids, it's no mystery that companies have been hiding behind the bugaboo of inflation to justify continued high prices, even though inflation is now basically in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, there's a recent study I saw headlines about that more than 50% of recent inflation has just been corporate profit capturing.
Yep.
So rather than cost of goods rising because of uncontrollable forces, corporations are basically just agreeing to keep prices high.
Yes. And it is immoral, and it is price gouging. Here's another item from his website: ban Congress from trading stocks. This is a fairness issue that resonates with many voters who already hate politicians and believe correctly that they shouldn't profit from insider trading. He strongly supports American manufacturing. His website lists, quote, "make more shit in America," end quote, as one of his core principles. He supports the expansion of union rights. To address income inequality, he wants to raise the federal minimum wage to at least $15 per hour. Shamefully, it's $7.25 right now.
Yeah.
Says Fetterman, quote, "How on earth can you make $180,000 as a senator with Lux Healthcare and sit there and be like Nero, thumbs up or down, on paying someone a living wage?" End quote. He wants to legalize marijuana. It's not popular with GOP politicians, but it's wildly popular with all voters, Democratic, Republican, and Independent. Looking at Fetterman, you might think this one is self-serving, but he doesn't use pot himself. He supports immigration and legalization for dreamers. His wife, Giselle, a Brazilian immigrant, came to America at the age of 7 and was once undocumented. But he also supports recent bipartisan efforts to rein in the flood of migrants at the border, which we've learned from recent polling is now the mainstream position of most Americans. He supports a single-payer health system to make health care cheaper and more accessible. He supports community policing and limitations on the use of deadly force, but opposes defunding the police. And as a former mayor of a crime-ridden town, understands the centrality of public safety in the minds of voters. He's a gun owner who hunted deer since he was a teenager, but supports greater restrictions on gun purchases. And he supports abortion rights. This is not a comprehensive list. I left out his views on things like foreign policy or the Senate's arcane rules or LGBTQ rights and some other cultural issues because they're not relevant to this conversation about re-engaging with working-class Americans. Though I'm calling him a blue-collar liberal, Fetterman doesn't like to pigeonhole himself. Asked whether he was a populist, he replied, quote, "I would describe myself as a realist. It's real that you can't live off $9 an hour. Climate change is real. I think we can all agree that you shouldn't hear gunshots at night. I don't call that populist. It's just the common sense characteristics of a compassionate democracy." End quote. Fetterman cultivates an idiosyncratic politics that defies categorization. Fordham University political science professor Christina Greer described him as, quote, "simultaneously progressive, moderate, and conservative," end quote. He takes heat from both sides. His stance on climate change is a good example. Like most Democrats, he believes it's real and must be addressed urgently. But after initially calling fracking, quote, "an environmental abomination," end quote, he changed his position and is now open to permitting fracking if it's strictly regulated. And he's dismissive of some of the political left's absolutist rhetoric about climate. Edward Isaac Dovere in The Atlantic wrote that Fetterman thinks the Green New Deal is ridiculous for proposing that America could move entirely to renewable fuels in just 5 years, given our ongoing energy needs and an electrical power grid infrastructure that isn't yet up to the task. He told Dovere, quote, "Republicans need to get honest about confronting climate, but Democrats need to get honest about energy," end quote. American voters are often castigated for paying attention to everything but policy in the choices they make. They size up politicians in ways that don't necessarily translate to good governance. They vote for the taller candidate, or the male if he's running against an outspoken female, or the one they'd rather have a beer with, or the perceived straight talker, even if he's actually full of shit. They make snap judgments from the gut rather than from the head. They liked Bill Clinton because he could feel their pain. They interpret Trump's loudness and belligerence as strength. They favor the candidate who's just like them, or at least more like them. But even using these frustratingly anecdotal metrics, John Fetterman connects. It doesn't require mental gymnastics to support him, because he's more like his voters than just about any other politician. Because he's a blue-collar liberal, genuinely committed to uplifting the vast working class that's been left behind by leaders of both parties. He is that rare political synergy, an authentic messenger articulating the correct message. Democrats have a tendency to nominate people who are, in the words of David Leonhardt of the New York Times, quote, "ideologically consistent candidates whose presentation resembles that of a law professor or think tank employee," end quote. Leonhardt thinks that for Democrats to make gains with working class voters, quote, "they probably need to moderate their liberal image on social issues and double down on economic populism," end quote. Fetterman fits that bill. To be sure, he's not the only blue-collar liberal in Congress. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who faces his own tough re-election fight this fall, is a similarly disheveled-looking working-class warrior from the Rust Belt. But when you consider the total package, the epiphany about serving others instead of himself, the creative ideas to re-engage with disaffected voters who view politicians with suspicion, if not outright contempt, the regular guy aesthetic, the raft of working-class-centric policy positions, the snarky sense of humor, the willingness to change his mind or to speak up against bad actors in his own party, his human frailty as a stroke survivor with a history of depression. I think there's an argument to be made that John Fetterman is sui generis. The potential reach of his brand of politics is both deep and wide. Of course, all corners of the Democrats' big tent need care and maintenance, but some voting blocs deserve more attention than others. To grow their vote, Democrats must chase people who left the tent recently, or dip their toes in and out of the tent, or wander on its periphery. Fetterman's crossover appeal is the formula for success with that elusive group. Keep in mind that it's not necessary for Democrats to win back all or even most white working-class voters. That ship has probably sailed. It's about mitigating the hemorrhaging of such voters, or as John Nichols wrote in The Nation, quote, holding the line in Republican red counties where Democratic candidates cannot afford to get wiped out, end quote. If Democrats can persuade even a small percentage of working-class voters to come back, that alone marks the difference between a narrow majority coalition that has to sweat out razor-thin victories against batshit crazy MAGA Republicans, and a durable governing majority that can fully enact its legislative agenda. The logo of Fetterman's Senate campaign was "Every county, every vote," a sign of his determination not to concede working-class outstate voters in the regions of Pennsylvania not friendly to Democrats. In 2008, the last paradigm-changing national Democrat, Barack Obama, won 40% of the vote in those counties. But today, just 16 years later, Democrats struggle to reach 25%. In 2022, Fetterman outperformed Joe Biden's 2020 performance in all those places. I have long believed that these voters are receptive to a full-throated, blue-collar liberal message centered on the issues that matter to them. Fetterman gets this. He understands that, as George Packer wrote in The Atlantic, quote, the working class isn't a puzzle whose solution comes with a prize. It is a constituency comprising half the country whose thriving is necessary for the good of the whole, end quote. Democrats would do well to elevate Fetterman's politics, if not the man himself. Have I convinced you, Mark?
Well, he's certainly a compelling and fascinating candidate, though the physical frailty does give some cause for concern.
Yeah.
I'm left wondering a couple things. And one is around a topic which I feel like you teased, but I didn't see, which is that in this hypothetical blue-collar liberalism coalition, you double down on things like wages, and you'd pull back on some of the recent Democratic Party social commitments. Which social commitments were you thinking of?
All the hot-button cultural issues that currently divide Democrats. So anything from trans rights to the situation in Gaza and the cleaving of the Democratic Party between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian factions. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying the Democrats should forsake those constituencies or pull back from historical positions they've taken that make sense and are right. I'm just saying they shouldn't foreground those issues, because there's a constituency to be won here with an economic appeal.
Right.
And that's the priority, you know? The difference between passing your agenda and not is huge. And in order to pass your agenda, you need to grow the tent, grow the coalition, and win back some of those working class voters. So not engaging in culture war issues that alienate those voters, I think, is one of the key jobs that Democrats need to do in the next few years.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if there's a cost attached to that, which is so many Republican victories over the last 10, 15, maybe even 20 years have been driven by appealing to the passionate base of the Republican Party. A passionate base which, from our perspective, is a little bit crazy and xenophobic, but are also 100% reliable Republican voters. And I wonder if the passionate base of the Democratic Party are those people who are firmly committed to things like social justice. I feel like there's potential risk there of letting go of the things that motivate the base. And if you do that, then you carve out the heart of your support.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. But then you get to the voting booth and it's your guy, Fetterman, Biden, or the alternative, right? And are you really not going to pull the lever for a Democrat who has not foregrounded cultural issues and essentially elect Trump or MAGA Republicans who are going to be gazillion times worse on those very issues you care about?
No, but considering that the challenge often for Democratic candidates is to get the vote out in the first place, because young voters in particular can be hard to get to the polling place, then I think there is a valid cause for concern that you not take any steps rhetorically or otherwise that could simply depress the number of people who turn out for you at the polls, particularly if there's segments of your voting population whose whole reason to show up in the first place is to cast a vote in support of issues that they feel passionate about.
Yeah, I take your point, but I guess where I would push back is that this necessarily needs to become an either-or proposition. Why can't it be a both-and proposition? Instead of getting swept up in the cultural furor that's started by Republicans on issues like immigration or drag time story hour and stuff like that, why can't we push a blue-collar liberal agenda that appeals to a lot of the voters who are led astray by those cultural appeals, while simultaneously sticking to our core principles, pro-social justice principles? It's just a matter of degree and the foregrounding of those things, Yeah. That's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Democrats have lost the popular vote in one national election in the last 30 years. 2004. Arguably, they could have won that election if the Republicans had not put so many gay marriage and referendums on state ballots that year around the country, when gay marriage was the big, scary bugaboo that the cultural conservatives were concerned about. And so I feel like sticking to the discipline of a blue-collar liberal message that's about things like raising the minimum wage, which Republicans want just as every bit as much as Democrats do, and foregrounding that part of the message is a way to peel off that certain number of voters, certain percentage they need to get what I call the durable majority.
Yeah, fair enough. There's another topic which has been in the back of my mind as I've been thinking through your presentation, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but let me just put it in front of you to get your reactions, which is the premise of bringing back former Democratic voters who switched over to Trump, bringing them back within the umbrella. It raises the topic of the fact that many of those voters responded positively to a pretty racist message. And so I wonder if bringing them back in would require not a racist message on the part of Democrats, but sort of a unwillingness to speak out on certain topics in a way that might alienate another very important critical element of that Democratic coalition, which is Black voters and other non-white voters. A zero-sum game where you gain some voters and you lose others. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess my thought on that is, which voters are you going to peel away? You know, some voters are gettable and some aren't. Trump voters are a lot of things, like America. There are some racists, but there are a lot of non-racists in the Trump camp. And they're people who are frustrated with politics as usual, liked Trump as the disruptive force, like the idea of blowing the system up and stirring up the pot, and are frankly frustrated and pissed off with the way their wages have deteriorated and their standing in American life has faded. I think a lot of those voters are persuadable if there's a messenger like Fetterman with a blue-collar liberal message. And we don't want to attract the racists, and we won't, because those voters have a different priority and they're not going to switch, and they found their party. The Republicans have been party of racism since Reagan ran for president in 1980, and that's not going to go away.
I'd push it back further than that. I'd push that back to Nixon's Southern campaign back in the 1970s.
Yeah, it really started in the 1960s when the Democrats passed the Civil Rights Act and a lot of Southern Democrats fled the party for Republicans. We're not going to get them back. Do we want them back? I don't.
Yeah.
But it does a disservice to Trump voters to paint them all with the same brush. They're not all like that. A lot of them are just frustrated working class people who've been stiffed by the man. And they identify Democrats as the pointy-headed elites that are screwing them. And there's some truth to that. But when John Fetterman, with his look and his message, undoes that damage by preaching the kind of politics that they want to hear, I think there's a percentage of those voters who are persuadable. And that's the difference between bare majorities and a durable governing majority.
Okay. Well, my last point actually pertains to something that you just said, which is captured in the phrase John Fetterman with his look and his message. The topic of this week's episode is the perspective that can create an enduring Democratic majority. But a lot of what you've shared here is about Fetterman individually, his authenticity, his look, the hoodies and the shaved head and the tattoos. And I wonder how much of this is Fetterman's politics and how much of this is Fetterman, where the same things might not work as well if it's presented by a woman or by a person of color or by someone who does wear a suit. And if what you see as the power of Fetterman's message might be the power of Fetterman individually, and if he's not the candidate, it might not work as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, Mark. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I would like to believe that the ideas are stronger than the person, you know, and that it's really what he's saying that's grabbing people more than the looks of the person who says it, though I acknowledge in my presentation that that's part of it. Really, this is about whose ideas might push the party forward and get that additional incremental percentage of voters to form the durable coalition. And it's Fetterman's ideas. Now, is he going to be the man? Will it require him to be the man who runs for president and becomes a transformational figure at the top like Barack Obama was not long ago? The jury is still out on that. But what I'd like to believe is that his ideas will gain more currency in the party, and then other people, even the button-down types, the Connor Lamb types who come from central casting, or young minority candidates, people of color, will be talking the talk, the Fetterman talk, even if they don't look like him. And that will be enough to carry the day.
Well, thank you for taking me through this. This was interesting food for thought, and you could well be right. So with the next episode, we get back on track with our usual format, which means that you have a question for me.
Yes.
Are you ready to ask it?
Yes. I think you're going to like this one because I know you're partial to forward-thinking questions that involve new technologies.
Yes.
So I've got one for you this time. I live in a complex of 8 30-story high-rise apartment buildings with on-site parking for residents who have cars. I don't have a car, but that's a topic for another podcast. Recently, a couple of the buildings in my complex installed electric vehicle charging stations in their parking lots.
Mm.
My understanding is that the installation of the EV chargers was completely subsidized by our local power company, which I'm guessing is probably receiving further subsidies from the federal government as part of the clean energy transition.
Most likely.
I'm inclined to think this is a brilliant strategy both by the government and by my complex, under the theory that if you make it easy for drivers to charge their vehicles, they might forsake gas guzzlers and go electric. But when it comes to the still limited range of electric vehicles and the scarcity of public charging stations, it's the opposite situation, meaning it's a huge disincentive toward going electric if you can't find a charge when you need one. So that got me wondering, is there a comprehensive national plan for transitioning from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles? And when are we likely to see a critical mass of EVs on the road?
Okay. I don't know the answer to that question, but now that you've posed it, I'm interested as well. So I'll look into that and we'll see where it takes us.
Great.
Okay. If you'd like to learn more about the things that Joe shared today, you can find all of our sources posted to every episode within our Facebook channel. You can find that at Mansplaining the Podcast. There's a post for every episode with our sources. You can leave comments and questions. You can even use that forum to ask us a question for a future episode.
And this time you'll see the Oz crudité ad if you haven't seen it before. It's a dandy. So Go to the Facebook page.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to do us a solid, you can do that by leaving a rating or review if you've not already done so. Go to the podcast platform of your choice, be it Apple or Spotify or Google. Find us on there. We are on all of the major platforms. Leave us a rating, leave us a review, tell other people what you love about mansplaining. If you want to just tell people at random about mansplaining, I'm not going to tell you not to do that. You could stand on street corners. You can maybe find someone who's shouting at people about Jesus and ask to borrow their microphone and shout about mansplaining.
Build yourself a mansplaining sandwich board and stand on the corner in the most well-traveled part of your town or city.
Yes. Mansplaining is here, it can say on one side. And then, John 15:7 on the other or something like that.
Right.
You've got about 2 weeks probably before our next episode. So you got a lot of time to think about it. And until then, we will bid you adieu. That was Joe. This is Mark. And we'll see you then.
If my presentation didn't completely convince you, maybe this will.
Listen up, let me introduce you to a real G. Representing Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, that's who he be, straight from the Steel City, where the hustle don't stop, fighting for the people, he ain't never gonna flop. Raised and bred out, a place where dreams fade, but Fetterman rose up, he ain't not afraid with his signature look, head shaved and tatted, he's a force to be reckoned with, his presence never doubted. John Fetterman, a Steel City warrior, fighting for justice, never in a hurry. He's got the streets talking, making moves so bold. Pennsylvania's champion, respected as gangster role. From the streets of Braddock to the halls of power, Fetterman's climbing higher by the hour. A voice for the voiceless, he's standing tall in the Senate's chambers, he's answering the call. Tackling equality with every breath and step. His fight against injustice, you can bet he's adept. Healthcare, education on his agenda so tight. For every Pennsylvanian, he's ready to fight. John Fetterman, the Steel City warrior, champion of the people in the arena. From Braddock to DC, his mission remains bold, a beacon of hope, his story's being told. Tough as the steel from the mills of this town, his words strike deep, they never let you down. With a heart as big as his towering frame, Fetterman's legacy, Pennsylvania's fame. No stranger to struggle, he's seen it face to face, but with compassion and strength, he's running this race. Economic revival, justice, reform, he's weathering every political storm. With a nod to his roots in every debate, he's reppin' PA, making it great. A family man with a cause so true for the Keystone State, there's nothing he won't do. So here's the Fetterman, a legend in the making. For every step he's taking, history's awakening. John Fetterman, keep on fighting your fight. Pennsylvania's proud, standing strong, united and bright.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.